read. I'll be brief. Just to introduce the panel, this plenary session asks us to reflect on political dimensions of land and agrarian struggles today, particularly in relation to the rise of far-right authoritarian politics and the shifting geopolitics that increasingly target land, life, and society itself. Across rural and urban settings, new forms of politics are emerging. Some mobilize rural and agrarian constituencies and working people. Others seek to demobilize and divide them. Understanding this contested terrain is crucial. At the most immediate level, working people across the world continue to defend land, territory, and commons against multiple forms of dispossession, whether through corporate land grabs, extractivist projects, or climate-driven displacement. In context of authoritarian pushback and deepening ecological breakdown, defending land and commons is not only about livelihoods. It's about survival, about people's sovereignty, and about the right to self-determination. These struggles for land and territory compel us to rethink the very meaning of politics and resistance. They reveal how the defense of commons and ecological futures is inseparable from questions of democracy, freedom, and liberation. At the same time, these struggles are profoundly shaped by national and global dynamics in South Africa, Colombia, Indonesia, the United States, and beyond. Debates around land reform, rural democracy, and food systems unfold in landscapes marked by authoritarian resurgence, the rise of neo-fascism, and deep crisis of governance. Globally, the reconfiguration of blocs such as the BRICS, the weakening of multilateral institutions, and intensifying geopolitical rivalries all shape the terrain on which movements must organize. Our panel will speak to these challenges and the possibilities, engaging with themes such as the politics of the far right and geopolitics, has assaults on land, life, and society, the politics of research, how certain forms of knowledge have fueled land grabbing, and what research might look like if movements and critical scholars shape the agenda. The politics of radical agrarian reform as a politics of alliance building beyond sectoral struggles towards constructing power across grassroots unity. Experiences from peasant movements such as the Indonesian Peasant Union will be important here to show how struggles unfold both at the field level and within agrarian food policy debate. The search for alternatives from below in response to global capitalist crisis and the limits of neoliberalism. Ultimately, this panel pushes us to confront urgent questions. How can movements and allies think strategically about alliances, campaigns, and reforms in this volatile landscape? How do struggles over land and commons intersect with struggles for democracy, sovereignty, and ecological survival? And what new forms of political imaginations are needed to advance justice, survival, and freedom? Our first speaker is Ainal Fuad from Indonesia, vice chairperson of Serikat Petani Indonesia. This means Indonesian Peasant Union, and a member of La Via Campesina Coordination Committee. He also represents at that committee Southeast and East Asia. Zainal is an active member of various La Via Campesina working collectives, and his participation in the process that resulted in the UN declaration on the rights of peasants was very crucial. Zainal, over to you, and I will introduce other speakers as they speak. Over to you. It's up to you. You can speak there or here, it's up to you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me in the important session on the politics of agrarian reform. Yes, SPI is a peasant mass organization declared 1998 in North Sumatra, and now we have 24 province, and SPI is a struggle for agrarian reform, and then food sovereignty, agroecology, and also cooperative. And regarding agrarian reform, now we already reclaim land about 600,000 hectares. So in this land, so we establish village of agrarian reform and food sovereignty area. So in this area, we implement agroecology, cooperative, territorial market, and of course the training school, and improve our and strengthen our organization. So the history of SPI is the history of the how peasant facing and struggle against land grabbing, criminalization, yeah, and also eviction, repression, and killer of peasant. So we have many cases of agrarian conflict on plantation and forest, and also in other areas. Now we have 191 agrarian conflict. So that's why our effort is how we can continue to reclaim the land, and at the same time, we influence our government and parliament to produce good public policy for agrarian reform, and also lead direct to FAO and Rome. So that's why in 2001, SPI with other social movement, NGO, so they mean it's just allies, yeah, conducted a conference on agrarian reform and right of peasants. So that means we struggle with the approach, human right approach. So at the time, we were supported by indirectly the President of Indonesia, and also National Human Rights Committee of Human Rights. So yes, regarding the politics, yes, it is long discussion, many history, and many perspective. First, in 1960, our government, the first president, released the basic law on agrarian reform. It is good law to distribute land. So one family have 2 hectares. But unfortunately, there is the story of civil war. So in the panel 1, Morgan said Indonesia has a tragedy. So almost 1 million people died because of the issue of agrarian reform. But there is a change, because in the time the parliament, the chair of parliament, who in the session of agrarian reform, is from the biggest Islamic organization. So this is strange that the civil war is between Communist Party and Muslim organization. So this like why by now we still in the gray area. Yeah. And after this is 1965. And then we have the new president from military dictatorship from 1970 until 1998. So the the agrarian reform was implemented by the program of transmigration, sending many people to the big island, like from Java to Sumatra to Kalimantan to Sulawesi. But these people to serve as a farm worker for big corporation, especially palm oil plantation, rubber. So that means as the fake agrarian reform. And at the same time, we remember the Professor Petroset read the article, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of Agrarian Reform Policy on World Bank. The good meaning is agrarian reform is not issue of the Communist Party of Leave movement, but also World Bank. So World Bank is the market agrarian reform. And in last June, World Bank conducted conference in Washington. The title is Land Securing. So what behind in the land securing on World Bank? So of course it's a link with the market agrarian reform, and then link with the land bank for investment. So then in 2000 until 2001, we have the also progressive government. The name is Abdurrahman Wahid, but only 1 year investment because indirectly he proposed movement to reclaim the land. So that means behind the investment or the civil war is the capitalist, we can say like that. And then from 2004 until now, there are program, national agrarian policy, and then land distribution. Yeah, but this just only land entitlement. It is the fake agrarian reform. Even 2014, the President of Indonesia came to our office in Jakarta and promised to conduct land distribution for 9 million hectares for peasant and poor people. But once again, this just only land certification and land entitlement. And then the new president is also the former general, special forces. They continue the program of the previous president on the national strategic program to open 20 million hectares for food and energy. But once again, it is for corporation, yes, because there are the new law of the the new law of job creation. It is like we give red market to a corporation. So what our position of SPI? As I mentioned before, we not only continue reclaim the land and establish village agrarian reform, but we continue to advocate of agrarian policy. Now, in next 5 years, we targeted 2 million hectares to reclaim land. What our reason? One, we will push our government to continue the regulation to overcome agrarian conflict, and the land is the object of agrarian reform. And second, our government also already promised that the forest area will release to people. So this part of the how we continue with struggle agrarian reform in the public policy, because we still have illegal standing is the basic law of agrarian reform. So this part of the how we continue to make the good policy, good willingness, but not NATO, not action talk only, but how our government can implement agrarian reform. And 24 September, we conducted mass rally because it is the National Peasant Day. So at least we have six demands to our government, and one is how the land is in the agrarian conflict is the object of agrarian reform, and then part of the land on plantation and forest is also the object of agrarian reform, and how the government to revise the present regulation on agrarian reform to make happen the whole land redistribution. And then at the same time, we will give input to the new law of food, the law of forest, the law of cooperative, and the law of the indigenous people. And also to input to president to establish National Council for Agrarian Reform and also social welfare. And the outcome of the big demonstration, not only SPI, but other social movement, finally our government is promised to fulfill our demands, and then Parliament finally establish the committee to overcome agrarian conflict. I think it is a good outcome in our big mobilization in 24 September 2025, so last month. So and then regarding ring IFAD. So since last year, I with team established high communication with Minister of Agriculture, and the Minister of Agriculture coordinate with the Minister of Agrarian and then also Fisheries. So finally, how in December during the CFS in October, finally Indonesia agreed that Colombia government as the host of the ICAT 2026. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zenal, for your input. I'm not going to summarize it. We'll later try to make sense of the whole inputs. I will now invite Wendy Wolfors. Wendy is professor at Cornell University in the United States of America, whose work on Mozambique, my own country, and Brazil has deeply shaped debates on agrarian change. Wendy will also help us reflect on the resurgence of far-right and neo-fascist politics in the US and its implications globally, especially on rural and racialized working people in what some call the belly of the beast. Over to you, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Boa. Thank you to my panelists here and to all of you, and especially a huge thanks to the organizers of this incredible conference, to Ruth Hall and to the PLOS team. It's really wonderful to have this moment to dialogue with all of you and to be with the group. It's an impressive gathering. It's an inspiring one. There are so many examples of activists and scholar activists of movements who are working in sustained ways in struggles over access to land and radical redistribution. It's a triumphant articulation here, and the examples are really inspiring, but the moment feels very bleak. Several years ago, we were talking about authoritarian populism, the rise of a new set of leaders across the globe who were loosely linked, who came to power on the backs of a wave of neoliberal privatizations and popular discontent. At that time, it was the mid-2010s. It was Trump, it was Bolsonaro, Modi, Erdogan, Putin, who mobilized the rhetoric of enemies all around us, of an us versus them, and who framed authoritarian control as protection. Today, many of the same people are still in power or back in power, reappearing, like Marx said the second time, as farce. You think it has to be a joke. But we're in a different moment where even the appeal, that former appeal to the people, to populism, as ambiguous as it was and as dangerous, even that is stripped away. And what is left is a much darker and more totalizing authoritarianism, divested of any notion of protection or development. This new moment, which instead of authoritarian populism, we could call authoritarian extractivism, this moment has moved beyond the post-war paradigm of development or sustainability. Many of us in this room, we critiqued development for being defined and imposed as a universal ideal, embedded in a rhetoric of equality that was condescending, colonial, and aligned with a market logic geared towards appropriating surplus for elite-oriented growth. We also critiqued sustainability for being defined in a way that soft-pedaled capitalism and offered no critique of inequality, coloniality, or the market. We critiqued these ideas as we should have, and we should, but what replaces them is not more progressive, it is more regressive. Within the framework of development, there was the aspiration, or at least the rhetoric, of broad-based progress of poverty reduction and inclusive social change. There was the possibility of a progressive land politics where distribution could generate something like growth or development, even though it was clearly oriented towards a market skewed in favor of the propertied classes. Today, we're at a point where political leaders see the world and its peoples as playing pieces on a checkerboard of extraction to be played and pitted against each other for the benefit of a very small class of elites connected not in boardrooms, but in the back rooms of the dark web, cryptocurrencies, big data, and weaponized AI. In this new economic order, land is not just a factor of production. The whole world is a giant plantation, and extraction is increasingly happening in zeros and ones. From massive data fields where land and water are used to house and cool unimaginable quantities of data, to digital agriculture where nanotechnologies invest crops and animals with new forms of life, weird life, that speak to computer systems, the robots are alive, through satellites to the rest of the world, our alienation from our own labor, from the food we eat, from the land we live on, in some ways feels quite complete. One of the key causes and effects of this authoritarian extractivism is the polarization and division between individuals. The us and them rhetoric is radicalized and racialized in ways that are no longer clear-cut along class lines, but rather along ideological and personalistic lines, creating the possibility of enemies of the state and capital in every house and every community. As Hannah Arendt argued in 1951, tyrannical regimes frequently manipulate populations by creating isolation, separating people from one another, crushing their capacity for critical thinking, and reducing their power to resist, something typically achieved through divisive narratives of us versus them. New technologies are being created in universities like mine to shield extraction from accountability. Environmental protections are gutted, indigenous rights trampled, resources are extracted without people on the land knowing who is responsible because ownership is coded in blockchain and Bitcoin, and international oversight or multilateral organizations are rejected in the name of profit and sovereignty. And I'll just take a moment to give you an example. A well-respected Brazilian coffee farmer turned entrepreneur. I wasn't going to give this example today, but I was talking about it at lunch with Boa, so I'll just elaborate a little bit. A coffee farmer who became a successful businessman. He made a sizable fortune on coconut water. He sold his coconut water business and he turned to what is referred to as impact investing. His most recent venture is something called One Amazon, O-N-E, Amazon, intended to promote sustainable development in the Amazon region. One Amazon is a secured digital asset investment product managed by Goldman Sachs. A crypto with purpose is the byline. The asset is made up of coins, where one coin represents 1 hectare of land incorporated into the project. Land is incorporated when landowners sign a long-term 30-year preservation agreement with One Amazon, promising to maintain their land sustainably. Enrolled land is then linked to the coins through blockchain to ensure transparency and traceability of the coins. Transparency, traceability, and importantly, tradability of the coins. Enrolled land must have secure title and will be monitored via crowdsourced data, drones, and satellites to ensure compliance with agreements. Given the lack of transparency with title in the Amazon region, One Amazon began with indigenous territories who had been ceded long-term usufruct rights by a national government. These indigenous leaders had signed on collectively to a preservation agreement with One Amazon, and the agreement was blessed by the president of the country. In total, One Amazon, at the point when I met them, when I heard about this project, had agreements covering what they claimed was 750,000 hectares of land. These 750,000 coins were going to be offered initially for $100 per coin, with the assumption that the value would rise because the coin supplies would be limited by the finite geographic expanse of the region. By land, they're not making it anymore. In many ways, this is similar to conservation programs that we are familiar with, based on REDD or REDD Plus or natural capital approaches to valuing nature to save it. The returns from the sale of coins were considered to be infinitely growing because as people took care of their land, other investors would buy coins thinking that the value of that land would increase the longer it was taken care of. And then proceeds would be distributed back in equal portions to the landowners, to One Amazon, and then to a development fund, where the development fund proceeds would go to landholders to invest in social impact projects, including creating an Internet of Things that would link all of the properties and the production coming from the Amazon into a wholly integrated system. The reason that I was familiar with the proposal was that it came to me as part of a university project. Could we think about ways to study this and to provide information about the baseline and the growing profitability? I tell you this story not because we engaged with the proposal, but because this is the landscape, I think, that the struggle for land is playing out on now. It is maybe, and here I'm just copying what Ben said much better, it is a landscape that in many ways is fundamentally different than the landscape of 10 years ago, 15, 20, certainly than 30, 40. So what are the implications of this moment for land politics? And there are many different things to be thought about. Many of the actors here who are intimately familiar with the way in which one can wage a successful battle against landowners, against the state, and against land concentration. But I would say we need to think about the way that the current moment represents a coherent worldview that we need to be able to align together to counteract. If the world is a plantation, and authoritarian leaders are like plantation owners who view forced labor and a handout over the holidays as the privilege of participation, then we need to think about alliances across the entire plantation sector. So importantly, I think what this conference is doing, what people here have been doing all along, and what this is an important moment for, is first of all naming the pattern, naming the particularities of this moment. What is new, what continues? This is an important part of what we're doing here. We're naming this moment as a systemic shift, not a set of isolated incidents or isolated proposals from crazy presidents or crazy entrepreneurs. The connections between these regimes, their mutual admiration, the borrowing of policy, the different bureaucrats who travel one to the other, and the coordinated attacks on civil society, they reveal a transnational, authoritarian, and extractive project. The second thing I think we're doing here is to defend a democratic space. Land rights movements require democratic freedoms. As these regimes shrink civic space, international solidarity and a fight for something like representation becomes essential. I think third, prioritizing research from those scholars who are in the room who have the time and the luxury to do research, doing research that uncovers the long history of the plantation and of these sort of politics as a kind of ideal. I'll speak for myself and say that we need to be thinking about research that happens on the land and for the people who live on the land rather than about them. And that's not a small move. And fourth and finally, we need to reclaim the future. We need to articulate an alternative vision, not a return to the failed development paradigm, but a democratic, ecological, and just approach to land and livelihoods that centers those who are currently struggling for land and excluded. And that really includes all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, for this amazing but also scary scenario that you're sharing with us. I'll now invite Mazibuko Jaha to speak. Mazibuko is actually a former student at PLAS, so our own products, if you like. He is a long-standing socialist activist and has been active in struggles for access to antiretroviral drugs, which was a huge struggle in this country when there was denialism of HIV. Also struggles around LGBTIQ+, equality, land reform, cooperatives, and municipal democracy. His decades of activism and scholarship continue to inform critical debates on social justice in South Africa, and I would say beyond. I mean, Southern Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. Over to you, Mazibuko.
Thanks, Boa, for that generous introduction. The song that Boa led, I think it's useful to explain it for the benefit of everyone. It's a song that we developed in the early 1990s in the Communist Party when we were trying to undertake political education. So it's a question and answer form. What is socialism? What is communism? What is feminism? So the lead singer asks those questions at several stages. And then the rest of the participants in the song give several answers. Each of these, socialism or communism or feminism, means the whole of the land in the hands of the people, the whole of natural resources in the hands of the people. The bourgeoisie are afraid because they want others to work for them. So, Boa, thanks for taking us back to connecting the land to these questions that the song asks. Ben has already spoken quite a bit in the earlier breakaway group, Professor Ben Cousins, about the South African context, which I would like to locate myself in, but also stray a bit into Southern Africa. Overall, if we want to think about the politics of the land question in Southern Africa, one of the major things we have to underline is basically the decomposition of the historic bloc that resisted colonialism and apartheid and ultimately defeated those. That is the case throughout Southern Africa. That historic bloc is no longer a political actor in and of itself. It has been demoralized, it has been displaced by a political elite that basically has made its peace with global capitalism and seeks to secure a little bit of the pie. Even in the case of Zimbabwe, where there was, from 2010, some radical land reform program. But if you look at Namibia, if you look at Mozambique, if you look at South Africa, basically the political class that is governing those countries survives very well because that old historic bloc that was largely constituted by popular strata, your workers, your peasants, and others, has been historically dissolved. Now, one of the major political questions facing the land struggle then is considering the possibilities for the recomposition of new forces that can drive radical change. We're seeing elements of this through the various land movements, whether it's movements focusing on food sovereignty or movements that are resisting mining and other forms of extractivism. But the problem with all these movements is the limited perspective beyond the local or immediate issues. The inability to an extent to connect the local immediate struggles to broader systemic and structural questions, and then developing strategies that can then relate to that. And what also then complicates it is the weakness of what was organized labor. In the case of South Africa, we've seen quite a significant decline of what was a significant trade union movement that had the ability to lift the whole of the popular classes in struggle and in hope. Even that has declined to a significant extent. In the case of Zimbabwe, the ZANU-PF regime has basically almost put to a death knell the possibility of power within the trade union movement. It's almost similar in the case of Namibia. Whereas in South Africa, with lesser repression, but you've also seen a significant decline of the labor movement. So then, in the various breakaway groups, the notion of alliances was raised, but also for this panel. So then, what we're talking about when we're talking about alliances in Southern Africa, it would basically be alliances of weakened forces, which then constrains in a significant way the possibilities of a radical push from below. And then contrast the state of these popular forces to the power of the old classes, if I can use that term. Those who own the land, those who control enterprises related to agricultural production, but also conservative forces who occupy power in the state. Yes, you've had an influx of black professionals into the state in South Africa and in Namibia, and obviously in Zimbabwe, but captured by the logics of neoliberalism, and not countenancing the possibilities of radical reform. What the minister was presenting in the morning could possibly be a breath of fresh air, given the 30 years we've had of basically neoliberal governance in South Africa, and generally beyond South Africa as well, in Southern Africa. So I think that's the second major point I would like to make, that these weak popular forces are facing well-organized old classes who occupy the land, who control the agricultural business value chain, but also more conservative forces who are basically running the states, which should be transformative states. Then that raises a question about how to understand the state and how to relate to the state. I've got a tripod approach to that question: with the state, beyond the state, and against the state. With the state insofar as these are legitimate governments. They are not colonial governments. They may be neo-colonial in form, but they derive their sovereignty from our vote. And in any case, many of the public goods, many of the demands we make at this point in time can only be met through the state. So we cannot ignore the state. We have to find a way in which to push the state. But at the same time, given their neo-colonial and their neoliberal character, we have to go beyond what they offer. In South Africa, there was a moment when we had to fight seed bills, which would basically have handed over seed to the private sector and would have criminalized indigenous seed and so on. So obviously, the seed banks that various movements are building are beginning to show an alternative beyond what the state can offer. Of course, those are still subordinate to the overall system of capitalism. Against the state at times, the experience of land occupation in Zimbabwe and also in South Africa as well shows that actually we cannot wait for legalistic illusions about land reform. Actually, land reform from below through land occupations is quite a critical component of what we have to consider. That's my tripod approach to the state. This tripod approach to the state is also related to an earlier debate which Wendy was engaging in the earlier breakaway group asked by Siviwe. Can we achieve a measure of redistributive radical land reform under a neoliberal capitalist system? And then Wendy took the debate to the spectrum of reform and revolution. My own take to that is related to what I've just said about the state. Your answer, Wendy, in that breakaway group, you talked about distinguishing between reformist reforms and reforms with a transformative potential. I agree with that, and I think it's important. So that's a question we always have to work out. If many of the demands around land reform need to be met by the state, what kind of state do we have to fight for? And is it going to be incorporation of landless peasants into dominant systems of food production, of land ownership, or is it going to be demands that we make that then make it possible for us to take the next step, given that overall the political conditions are not favorable to radical change? So I think for me, those are some of the things which we have to work out without condemning our movements. But I don't think we've reached that moment where we can grapple with how we relate with this. One aspect of this in Southern Africa concerns the chieftaincy. The chieftaincy is a particular substrata that was co-opted by colonialism, by apartheid, but now that found a way to reassert itself in the democratic period, in the democratic dispensations. So in that regard, they are more powerful than more progressive forces. Do you push an ideologically driven perspective that says reject the chieftaincy, or do you find a way to push for basic minimum democratic demands that open up space around which then we can build further and then hopefully get to a point where the mass forces have got a better hold and can push for more radical demands? So for me, that's the third issue which I think has to inform our thinking and our strategy when we think about the politics of the land question in Southern Africa. And then Professor Cousins and I have perhaps a disagreement on food sovereignty, agroecology, cooperatives, the solidarity economy. So the point Professor Cousins makes is, but these are not big questions. You don't raise the question of structural systems, you don't raise the questions of power, and ultimately the state has to play a central role. I agree with the critique he makes, but then I think there's something else which I think is critical related to this spectrum, reforms to revolution. In the mass strike, Rosa Luxemburg refers to the notion of a reserve fund. We're not going to be rising one day and defeat the capitalist class. But in that long interregnum, what do oppressed people do to actually build a reserve fund that can sustain them for the long term in the struggle? And that's how I approach then these initiatives of food banks, of seed banks, of food sovereignty, and so on. Whilst we are weakened as we are, what can we do, not just to ameliorate the conditions, but to begin to build the seeds of an alternative? 10 years of a mine worker in the mines, building a savings, building livestock at home, building a homestead in the rural space is some kind of a reserve fund if it is thought of politically, if it is thought of in terms of political organizing. Now, we are not doing that work as people who are organizing around the land struggle. This notion of a reserve fund can also be thought of as semi-liberated zones. What can we learn from what the MST has done in Brazil? For example, I've seen papers claiming that it has redistributed more land than the state, and some of those settlements have even begun to build quite a real alternative, quite real local economies. So I think, Ben, that's where we should take the debate in that regard. But then, in what Ben says, I recognize the limits of this rural romanticism I've just put forward. Ultimately, the state remains crucial. And this is where then Samir Amin becomes quite important when he talks about the notion of sovereign projects that create the possibility for states of the global south to delink, not delink in an autarkic way from the global economy, but create sufficient sovereignty, whether it is alternative trade blocks, whether it is particular forms of industrialization, particular forms of sovereign endogenous development that go beyond the critique that Wendy was putting forward about notions of development that have been dominant. The problem we have in most of the global south, we do not have political elites that drive sovereign development projects to increase the autonomy of the states of the south. So I think that's the fourth challenge which we are facing. Now, I don't have solutions to any of the problems I've put forward. But I think what remains critical then is to reinforce the logic of building from below all the time. Because ultimately, cumulatively, hopefully, what gets built can lead people to reach programmatic and political conclusions that takes the struggle to the next level. The biggest problem we face as we try to build patiently is the rise of both conservative politics and the rise of liberal discourses. This is particularly so in South Africa. We've seen ethnic identity, tribalized identity getting political expression through political parties that now have significant seats in parliament, and progressive forces or the left broadly do not have answers to that. As there is this rise of conservative politics, there is also the emboldenment of liberal forces, also in political parties, but also in the media. So this just closes off space in a significant way for progressive politics, particularly in South Africa. So comrades, that's where I will leave the discussion for now. Perhaps on question time, I can say more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Mazibuko. When I introduced you, I forgot to say that you were a member of the South African Communist Party, but you clarify that. I think it's important to, were you expelled? He's an expelled member of the South African Communist Party. Thank you so much. Lastly, I would like to invite Itaya Rojas, Itayo Sara Rojas, who is a PhD researcher at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and senior advisor for environmental and international affairs at Colombia's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. So you work with Minister Marta, I guess, with a long history of supporting Colombian peasants' movements. ITA has also been active in implementing Colombia's 2016 peace agreement, including the socioeconomic census of ex-combatants. What else? I think that's it. Over to you.
Thank you, Boa. Thank you, the rest of my colleagues here in the panel. I have been, I don't know how many times in front of this room today. Some of them I didn't want, and I want to clarify that. but this time I wanted to be here, so better that I do a good job. So I would like to present some key ideas around the politics of struggles, alliances, and theory for radical agrarian reform, departing for our core argument, because I do think that it's not just an individual worry, but a common struggle that we share, and is that we share this need of develop struggles for radical transformation of power relations within the socio-ecological system of production linked to land. We want to change that. And this makes us consider and go beyond traditional agriculture and include new frontiers like carbon markets, conservation schemes, tourism. And the central question in this changing context is how we do unleash and sustain structural change in the distribution of land and resources. And this is why we engage in these debates of struggles, policies, how we do think that the agrarian reform in the 21st century will shape. And in doing so, I do think that we need to move beyond individual partial struggles and sectorial demands. And this is a point of view that comes from my experience from within the government and also as a scholar activist. And let me argue that this transformative change is possible only through the conscious construction of multiple strategic alliances across different arenas. And I propose 3 different arenas of alliances. The first one is the alliance on the ground between grassroots movements to build unity and collective action for radical transformation, as was already said here in this panel. The second arena is the alliances between the state and the grassroots movements, and this is what Jonathan Fox and other scholars have called the sandwich strategy for creating pressure and leverage. And the third one is the alliances between the academy and the social movements, critical scholars with reformists within the state to co-produce knowledge and strategies. And that's what some scholars like June Borras and Jennifer Franco has elaborated as scholar activism. So under no illusions, as all of you know, building these strategies and these alliances is as absurdly difficult, but it is not impossible. These alliances that I'm talking about, they do not occur in a vacuum. They emerge in a specific and contentious context. And one example of this is that one might assume that landless people sharing a common plight will naturally unite. However, this is not the common case. In fact, I will say that this is one of the rarest one. And the question of how to build unity has been a central and enduring challenge for social movement organizers and also intellectuals. And to make this point, I would like to take some examples from my home country and the research that I have done in the Colombian Amazon on land struggles involving peasants, indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities. And despite the powerful commonalities that they should unite them, there are multiple tensions between these social groups. And I would like to say that we need to consider that all these groups, peasants, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, they share fundamental material conditions, at least 2. So they depend on land for the daily reproduction and economic production, yet they are systematically denied access to it, and they are, in essence, landless people. And the second condition is that because they lack access to land, they are forced to depend on their sale of their labor power for their survival. And this has been theorized as classes of labor, as Henry Bernstein will say, or as working people, as Professor Chibji will say. And despite these common material conditions, the Colombian state and Colombian and also capital has played this strategy of divide and conquer. And in Colombia, one part of this divide and conquer strategy has been deployed through the legal framework, which fragments collective struggles. So they have separate laws governing indigenous resguardos on one hand, black communities councils in another, and peasant reserve zones, and also victims of the conflict seeking for restitution. So in practice, all this complexity of the legal framework has led to the fragmentation of struggles for recognition and access to land, and has generated a conflict between these communities, and has proved how effective this strategy of divide and conquer by the state and capital is. So I'm not denying the victories, but we must acknowledge that the impressive quantitative gains that my boss just introduced you before, in terms of title hectares, is impressive. And when we celebrate each of these victories, and it is not just the result of the political will of the government, it's also the result of a sustained struggle carried out by these communities. But what I'm saying is that we need to examine these figures, these victories, critically, not to devalue them, but to ask how we can protect these hard-won gains and transform them from individual trophies into building blocks of a collective shield against the permanent assault of capital and the state. So that's the critical question there. And there are some visions, a perspective of unity, and I do think that this has been also developed by the concept of agrarian climate justice and the 5 Rs, and not just as a conceptual tool, but also a resistance practice. So there are inspiring examples in this vision in practice in the Colombian Amazons, in organizations that I have been working with, like Cordosac, which they push forward for daily alliances amongst indigenous peoples, ex-combatants, peasants, rural workers. And they unite to the overreaching framework of agrarian climate justice. For instance, they undertook a forum, a territorial forum in 2022 that they called the Forum for Agrarian Climate Justice Against Hydrocarbon Exploitation in the Amazon. And this has marked the beginning of grassroots alliances for systemic change and direct defense of the Amazon against the capital's assault. So bringing to the table Jennifer Franco and June Borra's notion on agrarian climate justice, this just can be operationalized through the 5 Rs, a powerful umbrella for articulating struggles, which has also enlightened the land reform program that we have now in Colombia. Redistribution of concentrated land, restitutions of rights, not just property, the regeneration of degraded soils and ecosystem, the recalibration of productive practices, and representation and community-led direction of change. The second arena, so that's the first one, the alliances between and among grassroots movements and how difficult it is. The second arena that I'm proposed to analyze is the alliances between the states and grassroots movements, which is what has been called the sandwich strategy. So it actually was a concept that was built upon the experience in Mexico and in the Philippines. So the style from these comparative global experiences and refers to the initiatives that enable mutually reinforcing empowerment between the broad-based social movements and actors within the government committed to transforming the state, which was also part of what my boss was referring when she was addressing to you today. So this refers to the strategic questions of the conventional dichotomy between collaborative and adversely state society relations, and recognizing that both can and must happen at the same time, simultaneously to drive radical change. So transformation requires reformers inside the state, pushing for structural reforms from above, while grassroots movements push from below. And that creates a virtuous cycle where each strengthens to each other in a common interest. So also this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It unfolds in a context where the state is not a monolith but a terrain of struggle, and where the key is for the insider reformers to take actions that can reduce the risk and cost of collective action for social movement. As the Minister of Agriculture just said, in Colombia we are advancing this through concrete policies. We have engaged over more than 500 municipal agrarian reforms committee, which is a power-sharing body that institutionalizes peasant voice for agrarian reform, and it's a channel in which we can take land demands and also distribute land. At the same time, we have the action of the Special Assets Agency, transferring the control of confiscated land that was before under the control and ownership of drugs dealers to organize rural community. And this is somehow like our shy experience of this sandwich approach in Colombia. But the key question of this alliance between state reformists and grassroots movements is, what can reformers inside the state do to directly counter and dismantle the divide and conquer strategy? So that's the main question. If I claim and if I say that the Colombian state and the legal framework under the Colombian state has divide and conquer, apply this strategy, how now the people who are taking part in the state are going to dismantle this long-standing strategy? And the answer, it's quite complicated, but I will dare to say that lies in using the state levers to actively enable and protect grassroots mobilization, and understanding that the empowered social movements are the best guarantee for sustaining reformist momentum within the state itself. And the third arena, finally, the alliance between academia, social movements, and also critical thinkers and reformists within the state. So in order to overcome academic extractivism, the one that we all denounce, we must move beyond the intention to engage in research praxis for social transformation. So this means producing not just analysis, but transformative knowledge. And transformative knowledge is a framework that aspires to stop knowledge infrastructure from reproducing exploitation and instead serves emancipation. The impact of research depends less on the scholarly aspirations and more on its uptake and application for collective action, both within the state and in society from the grassroots social movements. So forums like this, the ones Land, Life and Society, and also others that we have been participating and developing and strengthening each other, where we know each other as LDPI and others, play a crucial role because they become powerful spaces in which explanatory concepts are born. And these concepts and these ideas like agrarian climate justice, the sandwich strategy, working people, that distill complex reality but also inform action, collective action. In Colombia, our public policy for agrarian reform has been directly shaped by these concepts, developed in these scholar activism spaces. Our vision for redistributive agrarian reform is explicitly built upon this foundation. It integrates the framework of agrarian climate justice and the 5 Rs, employs the sandwich strategy for the state-society synergy, and acknowledge the vital role of scholar activism. So this goes beyond merely informing policymakers with recommendation, and it is about actively engaging in broader praxis to unleash and sustain structural change through strategic alliances, collective action, and the co-generation of knowledge. So this conference, this Land, Life, and Society, is an experiment of this third alliance that it brings together not only the academics, social fighters, but also state reformers who are trying to apply these ideas. We engage in a necessary and also uncomfortable praxis of mutual questioning, not to solve tensions theoretically, but to refine our collective struggles, making them more effective and oriented toward a systemic change that we all seek. In conclusion, the path to radical reform is not through isolated battles, but through the deliberate and difficult construction of alliances on these three integrated fronts. It is the synergy between grassroots unity, building a collective shield, the sandwich strategy, leveraging state and society synergies, and scholar activist praxis, co-producing transformative concepts. And that all of them, the three of them together, achieve the systemic transformation we seek. Our task is to nurture these connections between the fields and halls of powers and the halls of academia.
Thank you so much, Ita. I think we need to negotiate a little bit around time. We're supposed to end in 5 minutes from now. Can we allow ourselves to stay for another 15, 20 minutes for a bit of discussion, and also maybe to give the speakers another round of yes? Okay. I think this panel has been complementary, despite the fact that they shared on different contexts. Zainal shared the strategies and the work that they do at SPI, a peasant movement there, engaging policy and also exposing what you call fake land reform. And he spoke a lot about the strategy of titling, right, which leads to commodification of land and changing the social relation around land. And then Wendy, help us brought a kind of a picture of how is happening in the world, saying that this is not a localized US thing, it's a global, it's a systemic shift. And Wendy kind of invited us to reclaim the future and think about alternative to defeat what you call an authoritarian moment, which is characterized by big data, digital capitalism more generally. And then Mazibuku brought his, I guess, your hope in the political agency of grassroots from below, as you say, and despite the fact that there are weaknesses, the trade unionism is weak, and also like you mentioned about, you mentioned a regional bloc that has been dispossessed, has been reduced to. I guess you're talking about the Southern Africa SADC bloc, which now is kind of a lion without teeth, which is not helping to advance a progressive agenda of the people, but is there as a mere bureaucratic bloc. And you talk about the necessity. I think you see potency and potential in those pockets of resistance and alternative around them. And without wanting to romanticize the rural, you also, I think, invite us to avoid pessimizing it, right? And that's how I read what you shared with us. And finally, Ita, believes that to achieve structural change, and I think you're talking more about land reform, and you bring the Colombian case, you propose 3 strategies around alliance on the ground between movements, alliance between movements and the state, and also between the academy and social movements, and sometimes with the state. And you spoke about the importance of scholar activism and so on and so forth. It's also important, in my view, to acknowledge that the current nature of the Colombian state, or rather the government of Colombia right now, is kind of conducive for some of those strategies to work, but not everywhere that is necessarily possible, mainly in contexts and situations where the state is deeply against the people, right? And the state is neoliberal, and I think Mazibuko has spoken about that a bit. I wanted to touch on one thing that is actually happening between the US, South Africa, and Colombia, which is an attack, the US imperialist attack against these countries. I think that primarily because of the issue of Palestine, the solidarity that these 2 states are showing openly for Palestine, but the US imperialist forces are punishing. I remember, the U.S. expelling the South African ambassador from Washington. Recently, the U.S. removed your president's visa, so he cannot travel to the U.S., and so on and so forth. So and I also know that the attack the imperial attack is not only beyond the US, or it's not only outside of the US. Racialized people, working people in the US, migrant workers, and so on and so forth, are also under attack by this neo-fascist regime. So my question would be, do you see opportunities here to sort of build a connection and alliance between progressive forces, progressive movements and groups in the US and movements and groups outside the US to challenge the imperial project of the current regime in a manner that allows the reimagining of internationalism today, which I think it's a concept that has been a little bit forgotten. No, the concept of internationalism. I think it's a very important, powerful one. If you would like to reflect on that, you can do so. You're not obliged to do so. I will now open the floor for comments, questions. I don't know if you want to react to what Mazibuk said, Ben, but anyway, the floor is open. I know you're a bit tired, but we're gonna have dinner and party, so. Okay, how do we do with the microphone? There is someone who would like to speak that side. Can you please introduce yourself and first?
Hello, mine is a question. Sorry, I'm Upe Nyumberi from representing the World's Alliance of Mobile Indigenous People. And my question that I have is about the issue that, there's these problems with the imperialism and everything with the US and other countries. If they've expelled someone from their country, for example, I'm just wondering, what would be our loss? What would be that person's loss if they don't have to set foot in the United States again? That's a question. Then the other one I wanted to just say is, since we can be so strong about Palestine or other places, if we took the same energy and united as movements for the betterment of, for example, in our blocks, as previously mentioned, if we could unite together with the same level of energy, wouldn't that really give us good results? So my second question is really more of like, maybe for us all to reflect. But the first question, I just wanted to get some reactions.
Hello, Tara Weinberg here from Wits University. My question is somewhat similar. So I think one of the strengths of this conference is that we're coming from all these different places in the global south. And it sounds like in places like Colombia and Brazil and Indonesia, there is a mass movement around land that doesn't exist to the same extent in Southern Africa, as you spoke to, Mazibuko, the fragmented nature of our social movements around land issues here. So I was interested to hear from you guys and maybe from others, in terms of conversations we've been having so far, what is it that we in Southern Africa can take from what's going on in Latin America and Indonesia and so on, in terms of are there strategies, ways of building solidarity, like a new Bandung kind of thing, that we can do? And for those in Colombia, Brazil, South America, Asia, and so on, is there anything from Southern Africa that you've heard that would be useful in terms of movements there?
Yeah. Mazibuko talked about building a reserve fund, a way for people to keep going, something to fall back on in a time of acute crisis. So that brings to my mind something which has come up in the panels on redistribution, which is the importance of how we conceive of property. So many problematic redistribution programs have revolved around the idea of titling, individual titling. It's an idea which is taken for granted around the world. It's actually a very pernicious idea. Actually, capitalism is built on the foundation of private property. Digital technology, which should be owned by the peoples of the world collectively, are making a small number of people incredibly wealthy because they're privately owned. Private ownership is a problem. And I would suggest that what the reserve fund could involve building collective systems of property wherever and wherever one can. And that involves reimagining property, moving away from the all-embracing idea of property and then, indigenous people can have collective property. No, actually the commons is what is under threat, and the commons could be our way to survive the current crisis. We need to build and extend the commons, I think. And I think land reform contexts provide very practical contexts in which you can develop, build, extend the idea of legally protected collective rights to land and other resources which are needed to keep us all alive. And to fight back against these pernicious ideas of private property which are so dominant. So there's an intellectual agenda for scholar activists, together with people who know through their own experience that they share in the wealth of the world. It's a shared resource. And to build that alliance and to take the struggle against this pernicious idea of private, which, by the way, is strongly held by the middle class because they think it protects their way of life. Actually, the middle classes are also under threat from global capital. And as a recent report by a group called Commonwealth in the UK reveals, privatization in the UK over 20 years has actually made the whole country much, much poorer. And actually, wealth needs to move back into the hands of the collective, the people as a whole. So there are people even in the middle classes who are beginning to realize this. So I would suggest that it's been somewhat neglected in strategy, in discussion of agrarian reform, the importance of how we conceive of collective rights. And I think that could be given more prominence going forward.
Thank you all. My name is Enrique Castañón. I have a comment about the state and possibly a question for Ita. It's just, I obviously agree that the state is a key question, so we should always treat that very seriously. But perhaps there is a need to complicate a little bit the readings that we tend to have in terms of the state being very consistent kind of entity, like sort of these divisions, movements, state, civil society that I've heard was part of that, or being against the state, with the state, as if it was that consistent entity. It seems to me that it is more productive to think of actually existing the state as this kind of more chaotic kind of a range of institutions, the social relation, following Bob just if you want, this side of strategy. And I'm speaking partially because of the Bolivian experience as well. When we, with Evo Morales, the whole thing that happened in Bolivia, we have this hope that we finally conquered the state. So the state apparatus was for us to use. And it didn't turn out that way precisely. It is because the state has its own kind of logic, and as I said, it's just much more complicated. And I'm not advocating to not pursuing that. We need power. We need state power to be in our side as much as possible, but it's not kind of a tool or an entity so discrete as has been presented, or perhaps I misunderstood, but I wanted to comment that. And the question for Ita would be if you could comment on some tensions in the Colombian case and how you are navigating those. Thank you.
Enkosi. Ncedo Mngcibisa. I'm directed to Ubhuti Mazibuko. When we talk power, we must always think that we are contending against powerful class that is invested in violence, sabotage, and economic exclusions. Is your strategy also invested in those, I'll call them entities of power, because outside that, they will sabotage us, they will shoot, they will do whatever economic exclusion that they can do. Thanks.
Mapelandile from Inhlungu. Comrades, from the entire presentations, the observation was that the state has failed the working class, right? So, as a Marxist, I don't believe that a capitalist state can be used to attain whatever that we want to attain. So we need to rethink in terms of what would be a strategy, because all these neoliberal states has failed us. So for me, this thing that you want to work within the state of capitalism is not going to work. Because our assessment, as we are sitting here, all the presentations that we've already made here are suggesting that a capitalist state is not an alternative. The only alternative, I know it's radical alternative, overthrow the state and implement socialism, but it's a process on itself. So I just wanted to highlight that so that we don't have a shortcut of thinking things. Because I know now, because I just get a sense that people think that capitalism can provide alternatives. So that's what provokes my thinking as I'm sitting here. Sure.
It's distracted me a bit from my duties here. Apologies. Is there any other comment? I don't think we're gonna open a second round. So, well, maybe we might, but like, is there any burning question comment for now? No? Okay. I will return the microphone to speakers. I think we can use a reversed order and start with you, Ita. And to reflect on the questions that were posed to you, or any other questions you would like to respond.
Okay, I want to talk about 2 points that were raised. So the first one is the one raised by Professor Ben Cousins regarding how to conceive collective rights in agrarian reform, which I do think, as you say, that has been a neglected topic. However, I do think that this character of collective and common and for everyone without without making any distinction is pretty important, because collective rights are part of the Colombian legislation now. Like under our legislation, we have the recognition of collective property for two sectors, but not for everyone. And these two sectors compete with each other. And the others that they don't have that recognition, they are also seeking for it, or in some cases, they are opposed to collective property. So in this reimagining private property and including the neglected debate around collective property, the commons, commonality, I do think that we should go to the common basis, which I was referring, the common material life, and how to ensure collective rights for all these people that they share these material conditions, that they depend on land, but they don't have access to land, and because they lack access to land, they have to sell their labor power in order to survive every day. I just want to make a comment on this, because it's partially addressed, but partially is not enough. That's why we talk about the 5 arts and the whole comprehensive picture about it. And about the second question and the comparison with the Bolivian case, well, that's a pretty good one, and it's one question that most of the representatives of people linked to the Colombian government, to the current Colombian government, we get in different occasions and spaces, because it seems that the lessons from the pink tide in Latin America so far has shown that it fall behind of what it promised. And maybe, yes, it did, but in the Colombian, and I'm taking the bat, the Colombian case, this is the very first time that we have this experience, and maybe we could learn a lot of what was done in a good manner, and also the limitations and the pitfalls of other experiences, and especially talking about politics, like also the results in the past Bolivian elections shows how these coalitions and politics making within reformists and progressive forces didn't work out for different reasons. I'm not sure, maybe we can discuss that later and you can tell me why. But what I wanted to say is that we can learn a lot, but it doesn't mean that we will have the same end. That's like the future is still open. It depends of what we do in the different arenas that I mentioned. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I could be wrong. And for the second question of if we have faced some tensions, yes, several tensions, and how to navigate them. I was trying to think on some examples, but I don't feel comfortable to bringing them here, but one tension. So now when we start the direct acquisition program for redistribution among landless peasants, we had to engage in negotiations with landlords that we link to massacres and the main far right force, and we had to undertake negotiations with them. And I do think that that was one of the most difficult tensions that we face. How to navigate them? Well, I don't have an answer. We engage in these negotiations because we came from, as Morgan was saying before, we came from the idea that this negotiation is better than civil war. This negotiation is better than these far-right people and landed elites that have weapons. They just negotiate with us instead that they point their weapons against us, because that was what was happening. So yeah, maybe this idea of that we navigate this because we do believe that it's better to transform things with consensus rather than violence, because violence has been the status quo in Colombia for the past 60 years. So I do think that that's the main idea that we have had so far in order to navigate these tensions and avoid another cycle of violence in the country.
Okay. I hope we can carry on this conversation, even though I think what happens next is a party, and imperialism can ruin a good party. But I think it's a really important topic, clearly. I think politics in the US has become nakedly extractive. This is kind of what I was saying before. And it isn't clear what's spectacle and what's substance. It isn't clear what is being presented as bluster to distract you from the reality of what's actually happening. So plans to annex Greenland and Panama and Canada, it isn't clear whether these are just farcical ideas that are intended to create chaos, or if they are part of a larger and clear plan where imperialism becomes a new kind of colonialism. And this is something I think we need to pay really close attention to. But I think it's important to see beyond the spectacle, even with the kind of bluster from the president, to see how extraction in and by the US has been formulated as a backlash to what were seen as preceding years of perhaps progress made by different groups, left-leaning or socially oriented groups. The extraction right now, the rhetoric and also the actions of the government and of a small technocratic elite who are aligned with the government. This is opportunistic, it's nationalistic, it's protectionistic, it's a politics of violent retribution. We've seen that, this is the point, right, about the coming down on the pro-Palestinian conversations in the international arena and very much in the domestic arena. So those are conversations that are happening in all of those different spaces, and it's retribution of those who speak out and who are vulnerable wherever they are, whether they're in the US or they're outside. The ability now to find those people, I think, to new students who come to the university who have to go through social media vetting. Oh, sorry. A social media vetting to have all of their social media posts evaluated by the government, and those social media posts, of course, are not their own to begin with because of the media platforms, the social media platforms, but then they're definitely not their own once they've been across the border. So tied to these new technologies of surveillance, and I don't think it's obviously not an accident that we think about the new technologies that were developed in the Green Revolution, the application of chemical fertilizer that comes out of the Second World War. These new technologies in agriculture, some of which I outlined earlier, are also coming out of military research and development. So the idea of both the sort of articulation of imperialism but also of extraction, I think, is a really important one. This is imperialism that doesn't need multilateralism anymore. We've seen that very clearly, and that's in part because the mechanisms, I think, of control are so widespread. The question, why would we care if anyone had to leave the US? I think that's a really good question. I would answer it on two levels. And one is that there are many people in the US who are vulnerable, right? They're insecure, they're persecuted, and there might be power in thinking about alliances across those different groups, across national boundaries. And then I think the second level is that it's important to understand the politics of exclusion and violence in the US because the reach of imperialism goes beyond one country. There are ties, as we know, between elites and across national borders, and there are discourses and practice that are maybe being tried out in one place that will appear in others, that will be taken up, that will be copycatted, that will become part of a repertoire of politics that I think we need to be studying as part of a global phenomenon.
Thank you very much. So I start with the opinion or the perception that the state is always evil. Capitalism, maybe like just was Satan's. But state is the field of war. So that's why, so for social movement, so we should take two ways, inside and outside. Inside, then how we always give message to the parliament, to ministry or staff official, everything. Second, how we can influence political party because the system is like that. We cannot avoid to ignore as a political party. So that's why in SPI, so we support how to strengthen Labour Party. And then in our last Congress, 5th Congress in July, we declare we will to strengthen the unity of politics to achieve food sovereignty and agrarian reform towards social justice of Indonesian people. So it's contain how we more in-depth influence both in parliament, in political party, and also in our government. But at the same time, we will fight if the government is not good. But we agree if the government is good. So for example, I mentioned before, 2014, our president is promised to distribute land, 9 million. Even though in the past finally just only maybe less than 5%, but we still continue to influence. Not only national government, but also UN. We cannot escape or ignore UN. It's our second government. So while like Amashina active in Geneva, yes, also in Rome, in FAO, in IFAD, and also maybe in New York. So this part, how we take two ways. Of course, we take many issues to influence government. We can take the issue of the climate justice. So we can say that there is a land competition based on food, based on feed, based on fuel, based on forests, many F. So you have to continue fight this. And then we have a good example to work with both state and also NGO and other movement in how we proceed. We propose to have UN drop. So we use the spirit of Bandung, Asia African Conference. So why most of the ASEAN country and African country is support in the negotiation of UN drop. And also how we get a resolution on the UN working group on right of peasant. So this part how we convergent or we work together. Yeah, so this part of our struggle. And it is linked also with what Isa in the opening ceremony about the ownership and controlling. So this part of the challenge in Indonesia. Our government promises land distribution, meaning is for ownership, but collective ownership, not private or individual. But at the same time, government release also the social forestry, just on tenure. We reject this. We can control, we can access, but I don't promise that we can control. Sometimes government, I mentioned before, government have national strategic program. So suddenly, hey, this forest for carbon market, for biodiversity offset, for mining. So we cannot control. So why the important is how we have the collective ownership. And also link with the how we strengthen with the middle class in the urban area. Yeah. For example, SPI propose to have minimum support price on rice is good for us, but then government should support a subsidy on price, so then the low middle class and working class in the city can buy rice. So with part how we can work together. So, but from policy, so many many challenges. For example, Trump gave Indonesia 0% if import soya bean from US, but we export to US with the tariff 19%. It's crazy. It's not fair. But of course, we have member Campesina, NGO in US and Canada, so we can work together to fight the Trump's policies. Thank you.
On the question of global solidarity in the context of US fascism, with Palestine, with Black Lives Matter, with climate shocks, and so many other problems, I think solidarity is that much more possible, and actually things are taking place. Comrades in places like Jackson, Vermont, and other parts of the US are interacting around the question of radical municipalism with movements in Kenya, movements in India, and so on. They have sent an inquiry to South Africa and elsewhere on lessons on how to resist police occupation. That was the case in the South African townships in the 80s. But now, in light of what Trump is doing, so those are examples of things that are happening already. The question is, how do we reinforce that solidarity so that it becomes a much more widespread phenomenon, that we can feel that there is indeed a global moment, a global current, global momentum on these questions. And at the level of states, in my view, I think it would go back to that question whether we can force our states to really think about sovereign projects or even notions of alternative globalization or even notions of alternative trade blocs. I don't think we've got enough power at this point in time to push that, but I think it's something that we must place on our agenda. How do we rebuild? I think I painted the picture too bleakly, my sister. Some 15 years ago, there was no Inyanda National Land Movement in South Africa. There was no Rural Women's Assembly in Southern Africa. So there are examples of movements, of initiatives that actually are trying to shift the balance of power. And I think those are beginning to build confidence and beginning to demonstrate an alternative. Sorry to put it so bleakly. I agree with Ben on collective notions of property. For me, advancing knowledge production in that regard also then has to think of knowledge, critical knowledge, intellectual production, not just as an academic enterprise, but actually a significant investment in organic intellectual production from movements themselves, from communities themselves. I think there's a lot that people are experimenting with. If you look at land occupations here in Cape Town, particularly around COVID, all of a sudden, the allocated sites allocated by communities themselves were bigger than before for food production. But also there were even collective sites allocated for common needs, again food production, but also education and other allocations. My Marxist friend there from Intlungu Yasemachochombeni, when you ask them a question, why has there been this change about these land allocation sites? He says, once we've occupied the land, one of the first questions we have to confront is we have to build a community. That's quite, so that's for me, those are the kind of fine textured things we'll have to grapple with. The state, so ITA, you use the phrase, the state as a contested terrain. If you look at political literature of the African National Congress, of the Communist Party, they've used that phrase. The state is a contested terrain. We must go and occupy it. We must go and open up space and so on. For me, the interesting thing is in the 31 years now of trying to contest the state, swell the ranks, as the other phrase was, the state has absorbed and neoliberalized everyone, including communists. So there's something there which is in contrast to the Colombian experience that perhaps makes Bells skeptical of the state. Having said that, I think Bells, for me, the question is the ongoing, never-ending contestation between the political economy of popular classes and the political economy of capital. Marx celebrates the eight-hour bill, saying, in broad daylight, there we saw the victory of the political economy of labor over the political economy of capital. So it's that notion of whether we can win radical reforms that make it possible for us to advance to the next level. And for me, that question is related to the question of the correlation of social forces, the balance of power. With the Section 25 amendments, which would have made it possible for expropriation without compensation if they went through in Parliament. As mass movements focusing on land, we were absent in that debate. If we were stronger, if we were present, could we have impacted sufficiently on the ANC and the economic freedom fighters such that actually we get a progressive and better formulation in that regard? So again, the political economy of capital could hold back a possible radical measure. If you look at provisions on the local government system, we actually have got quite a radical local government system on paper. But again, as mass forces, we're not using those provisions to really push the state in ways that can radicalize things. So to conclude, for me, Bells, the question is that we're going to have a capitalist state for the foreseeable future. And we need to have strategies in relation to that. Otherwise, we would have to wait for a revolution down the line, whilst people's questions and issues and demands need to be resolved in the here and now. Sorry to take so long. Thank you.
I think this was a powerful plenary session, and I think it sort of set the tone for other plenary sections that we have. I think we have raised the bar here. The standard is very high. I want to thank Ita, Wendy, Zainal, and Mazibugu for joining us. I learned a lot from your contributions, and I would ask us to give them a big recognition once more. There are few announcements. Because there are some changes in the program, please follow the updated program online. The link is on the conference webpage and in the WhatsApp group. Is there a WhatsApp group? I'm not on it. Number 2, abstracts of all presentations are also can be accessed via conference webpage and also via the QR code on the online program. 3, dinner is at 7 p.m. sharp. We will walk over from here. It seems that there is space for everyone. So even if you did not confirm, you are invited to join for dinner. So it will be, it's dinner and dancing. It will